I turn to a Mueller witness, Sam Nunberg, who had an interview that you later told us the president watched on television, as well as Matt Mueller, chief spokesman for the Justice Department under Obama, similar role to Brian Fallon, as well as former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi. Sam, when the history is written, you will be in it, to put it in legal terms, perhaps as a footnote, which is better than being a big, juicy indictment. But you'll be in it partly for what you did at this table, which is explore the potential defiance of the special counsel probe. And you ultimately cooperated. What does it say to you about the president and Trump world that what you flirted with doing briefly and ultimately reconsidered is what Mueller says that Donald Trump did writ large? Not a day or two flirtation with defiance, but the president of the United States actively, repeatedly trying to defy the special counsel, trying to shut it down. When that failed, asking people to lie about it. Things that, to put it in plain English as we wrap up here with 5 minutes left on the beat, to put it in plain English, things that other people go to jail for.
Well, I cannot believe what Don McGahn had to go through during that short tenure of his at the White House. And I was always surprised that Hope Hicks left the White House, and I think I know why, having to be interviewed by Mueller. And finally, not being able to lie to the press, she was under oath, and she had to talk about a play-by-play of what Donald Trump asked her to do.
Is that what it comes down to with this president, that he asks so much of people, and after they've given up everything, it's almost like a bizarro Shel Silverstein giving tree. After giving up everything and they're reduced to a stump, the final question is, will you go to jail for me? And Michael Cohen didn't want to do it, and Don McGahn didn't want to do it, and I don't think you wanted to do it.
And you've served no use to him once you tell the truth. That was frankly it, and I think that's why you see a lot of them leaving or have left.
Say that again. So
you're not useful to him when you tell the truth.
I think that's right. I mean, and you see it in his response to the investigation. You see it how, I thought one of the starker things in the report today was how he behaved with witnesses, how he behaved with Michael Cohen, how he behaved with Michael Flynn, where up until the time they were cooperating, he was sending back-channel messages to them through intermediaries, through attorneys, to stay strong. The intermediary saying the president loves you, he thinks you're doing great. And then the minute they flipped, he would turn on them and call them a rat, attack them publicly, attack them privately. And you see it in his governing strategy, too. It's not just how he's dealt with these investigations. You know, last week we were all talking about the story where, you know, the Secretary of Homeland Security resigned because the president wanted her to break the law. That's just kind of how he uses people. He expects you to do everything for him, up to and including breaking the law. And, you know, I think there are a lot of people who are loyal to Donald Trump and will do a number of quite inappropriate things. But when it comes to putting themselves in jail, I think take the wise step.
Let me get in Gene, who hasn't spoken yet in this segment. Yeah. Gene Rossi, isn't that the bigger import of this report that I hold in my hand? Because we've discussed the facts in here that are helpful, not only to the White House, but to several of the people who did serve for Donald Trump, including Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump, who, according to this report, did not ultimately do anything that came close to becoming targets. And we report that out accurately along with the rest. Just like I told Jay Sekulow when he was on with us earlier today, there's good news here for your client, and we note that. But isn't the larger problem with the obstruction piece that the President of the United States is the one person in the federal government who has a constitutional obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed? And now America is stuck sitting on this evidence that shows repeatedly that Mueller has wanted us to know, whether we can do anything about it or not, that this is a president who falls short of that constitutional obligation, and he's the one person in government who's supposed to be most responsible for it?
If I were to do an opening statement charging a president with obstruction of justice, I would begin with this. In the end, my presidency is over, and I am fudgical. That's all I need to know about the intent of the president. Let me just say this, Ari.
And so why did Mueller put that in there? You're saying that's telling because why?
It goes to the corrupt intent of the presidency. The president himself engaged, if you read that report, in conduct that frankly is embarrassing. When I was reading the report, I thought I was reading the script for Godfather 4. I once charged a state prosecutor in Virginia with witness tampering and obstruction of justice. And if he's listening, he's probably laughing because what's in volume 2 of that report is 50 times more than what I charged in my indictment against that state prosecutor. And here's why. It's not just that he asked witnesses to lie. It's not just that he was trying to protect himself. It's that he didn't care about the judicial process and the rule of law.
Right.
And on January 20th
Right.
of his inauguration day, he took the oath to uphold the rule of law.
Right. And your point being,
He didn't
took
do
the
it.
oath, and Mueller's outlining evidence that calls it into question. You think of a fictional Godfather 4. As we await for whether Mueller ever testifies, I think of the actual Godfather 3. You think you're out, and they pull you back in. Bob Mueller left government service. He left the FBI. He was pulled back in to do this job. He may be pulled back in one more time to tell Congress and the world what he means by what's in here and what he thinks of the way the Trump Justice Department and the administration have dealt with it. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.